Shalom Alechem, peace on you, and welcome to the course Introduction to Judaism. It is in the context of the study of religion in the tour guide course, and what we want to do here together is dive into the world of Judaism. But first, let me introduce myself and what we want to do in this series of lectures. So my name is Ariel Fogelman. I am here broadcasting for the Haifa University, although I come from Jerusalem, with 20 years of experience in Jewish education of different kinds. My academic study was in the field of Judaism, and I have been teaching in informal and formal institutions, including a lot of tours. I've been in the touring business with Jewish groups mainly, and not only, really for the last 20 years, which has been fascinating. And I'm really glad to be sharing some of my experience with you as you are coming now to be tour guides yourselves. This course is made for two main groups, two main types of groups. One is for groups that know nothing about Judaism, that you're going to guide. And they're coming to the only Jewish country in the world, and they want to learn about it. Just like when I just went to Scotland or England or India, I really wanted to know about the culture of a place where I'm touring, where I'm staying. I wanted to talk to people, to hear, and you are the people that will be the reference point. You will be giving all the information about the Jewish state and what it means and what people see. So we will want to equip you with the basic knowledge required. Another kind of group that you will be guiding, perhaps, of course, everyone has their own niches. Another kind of group is the Jewish groups. The Jewish groups that come here following the collective identity, the personal identity, trying to deepen it, to connect to it, to connect to the roots. That is a very different kind of perspective that also the tour guide, of course, is responsible of supplying a very meaningful experience for a Jewish person coming on pilgrim. Not only pilgrim, identification, journey of search, of knowledge, of broadening the perspective. And that is one of the jobs that the tour guide will have also, leading the Jewish group here in Israel. So with that in mind, of the main goal of the course, to give tools in order to guide groups, we will be starting the first session. We will be talking in general terms about three topics. One, we will try to give the grand narrative, the story, the Jewish story, starting with the book of Genesis and continuing until the 21st century. The main story that every Jewish person that knows a little bit about their Judaism will know and you can refer to. Another main topic we will want to touch on is, what do Jews do? What is the tradition, the commandments, the culture, the daily life? What do we see the Jewish people do when we walk around Jerusalem, Tel Aviv? And how do we explain it? That can have to do with also the calendar, also daily life, also the life circle. Everything that has to do with what we do as Jews. And of course, everything has some philosophy to it. We won't focus on philosophy here, but we will definitely try and give a little bit of ideas as we go through our story. The line for the story will be the chronological line. We will be starting from Genesis and moving on. But the topics will not be separate. Every topic will be put on the line in the proper place. When we talk about Genesis, we will talk about Shabbat, which is already introduced in Genesis chapter 1. When we talk about Exodus, we will talk about Passover. So we will always jump back and forth between the basic timeline, that will be the guideline for the main part of this course, the timeline, and from the timeline we will be always referring to culture of the Jewish people today. Because the point is to understand the culture of the Jewish people today. We are using the chronological timeline just as kind of a framework, which is also interesting and also will keep us on track so we know where we came from and where we're going. So that's just the means. This is not a history class. Wherever it has to do with history and archaeology, there's a section that has to do with that exactly. But now we are going to talk about the Jewish religion as we understand it today in the 21st century. The first chapter that we will begin with will not be on the timeline. It will be more general. The first chapter that we will start with is the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the good book. I could ask you, how do you call this book? What names do you have in your language? Perhaps you would say Torah in Arabic. Perhaps you would say Bible. It wouldn't necessarily be true. Perhaps you would say Old Testament. That also would not be true when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. When we say Bible around the world, we mean the Old Testament plus the New Testament. For most people, when you say Bible, they mean that, and especially the New Testament. And also, if we take the New Testament away for Catholics and for Orthodox Christians, the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible are not exactly the same. There are many books, the Apocrypha, just like Tobias, the Book of Maccabees, Judith, Ben Sirah, and others that are not included in the 24 books of the Tanakh. So the Tanakh is our first topic. So how is the Hebrew Bible called? Not Bible, we said, not Old Testament. It's called either Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Scriptures, or I have here my Hebrew English, and you see the English, Tanakh, Tanakh. And this, of course, is the most important book. We are called the people of the book. You can find it in any home that is somewhat connected to Jewish tradition. A Jewish person living in Israel will get a copy of the Torah, which we'll say exactly what's the difference between Torah and Tanakh in a minute, but they'll get a copy of the Torah already in the second grade, and then again in high school at Tanakh, and then again in the army at Tanakh. So you'll have a lot of your different Tanakhs, a lot of your different books reflecting your different chapters of your own biography if you live here in Israel, or in any Jewish community that has Jewish education throughout the years. So we can see all over the world, for example, what we would see here is Ezra the scribe reading the Torah in front of the people in the Second Temple period. This mural is from Dura Europus in Syria. It was destroyed, unfortunately, but we have copies here in Israel. It is from the 3rd century. And you see here, in the 21st century, the Kes, the leader of the Ethiopian community, reading the Torah to all of his community in the Sigd holiday. The Torah as a focal point will be in synagogues all over the world. You can go to China, you can go to the United States, you can go to Africa, and when you go to a synagogue, the center of a Jewish community, the center of a synagogue will be the ark, and in the ark, the Torah scroll. How often do we actually take out the Torah scroll? How often do we actually read in public from the Bible? Any thoughts? Already Ezra, that we mentioned before, added 2 days to the day that already existed. According to the sages, already Moses decided that every Shabbat and holiday we shall read from the Torah. The Torah is the first part of the Tanakh. So every Shabbat we read. Ezra the scribe added the market days. When everybody comes together twice a week just to do business, don't do only business. Also remember what it's all about. So Ezra the scribe makes a law that on market days, on Monday and Thursday, we will be reading the first part of a weekly portion to be read in the next Shabbat. So every weekly portion will be kind of introduced. You will have a promo on Monday morning and Thursday morning. The Torah scroll will be brought out of the ark and into the center of the synagogue to be read to all. And then the full portion will be read on Shabbat together with a part from the prophets. So we have a section from the Torah itself and a section from the prophets. That is called Haftarah. Haftarah is the addition to the weekly portion from the Torah. It is a section from the Nevi'im part, from the second part of the Tanakh. So I already made this distinction saying not all of the Tanakh is in the Torah scroll. Let's take a closer look to the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll is the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the only books that will be in this scroll, which is handwritten on parchment by a scribe. The name of this scribe is Sofer Stam in Hebrew. Sofer means scribe, and Stam is an acronym for Samech, Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, Taf, Tfilin, phylacteries, and Mem, Mezuzot, Mezuzah. The 3 elements that have to be written on parchment by a scribe, handwritten. The Torah scroll is rolled on 2 sticks, but we don't call them just sticks. We call them the trees of life. Trees of life, that is out of a book of Proverbs, the idea that the Torah is like the tree of life to those who hold it. And it's also a verse we say when we bring out the Torah into the synagogue. Since it's the most valuable, precious item in the synagogue, in the Jewish community, we will glorify it. So you will find, for example, we have a special item to read from the Torah. You cannot touch it with the finger. So you have what we call in Hebrew a hand, yad, or etzba, is the name for the element you see on the second picture here on your left. We follow the letters and the lines as we read with this yad. And it will be held, the Torah scroll, in a special case if you're in a Sephardi community. And we'll explain the difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi later. But in some communities, the Sephardi ones, it will be held in a hard case, as the one you see here in the picture. And in Ashkenazi communities, it will not have a case. The scroll will be laid out on the table, as you see here in the middle picture. And it will be wrapped in kind of a coat. And therefore it's called me'il. Me'il means a coat. So you will see also that element when you see the Torah scroll. And you will see Torah scrolls when you go to synagogues, or if you go to any kind of Jewish museum, you will see the scrolls, and you need to have a language to know what you're talking about. If you're talking about a special element, if you're talking about the decorations. So 2 other decorations we see here. On the trees of life, we put these silver, beautiful, or other material, of course. This one here is silver. We call them pomegranates, or in Hebrew, rimunim. To be put on the trees of life. And also we can add the crown. The crown in Hebrew, keter. So that's just the visual as we come to see the Torah scroll. And as we said, it is part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is divided into three. Tanakh is an acronym. Taf, the T, stands for Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Nun, the N, stands for Nevi'im, prophets. And Chaf, Ktuvim. Ktuvim means writings. We'll say a few words about every one of these parts of the Tanakh. Let's start with the Torah, of course. So as we said, 5 books of Moses. Also called in Hebrew Chumash. Chumash from the word Chamesh. Therefore, also in English, it's called the Pentateuch. Penta in Greek, 5, just like the Pentagon. And the 5 books, as we said, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah is the holiest part of the Tanakh. It is the part of the highest authority. All Jewish law that is considered divine in Jewish tradition comes from the Torah, not from Nevi'im and Ktuvim. 613 commandments come from here. Why from here? Why is the Torah the only part that is handwritten by a scribe on parchment? Because it is called the 5 books of Moses. And Moses is considered by the Bible as the highest prophet that ever lived. Highest means the closest, most direct contact to God. On Moses it says, Pe el pe adaber bo. I spoke to him mouth to mouth. Says God about Moses. It is the highest level of prophecy, the most accurate one, and therefore considered the holiest part and the part of the highest authority of the 3 parts of the Tanakh. And this is the part that we read in the weekly portion every week. And now to the 2 other parts of the Tanakh. The second part, called Nevi'im, prophets. The prophets are divided into 2 parts. The first part, the former prophets, Nevi'im Rishonim, is a continuation of a narrative that started with the Torah. The Torah started with Genesis and moved on to Exodus and the story of the people of Israel in the desert. The successor of Moses is Joshua, son of Nun. So Joshua is the next book of the Tanakh. And then the period of the Judges and Samuel, who ordains the first 2 kings, Saul and David. And then the book of Kings, starting with King Solomon and ending with the destruction of the first temple. In other words, we can call this part of the prophets also, we can call this part historiographic description of events. It's writing the events, very easy reading. Just a big, very interesting story. Try. Take a cup of coffee, a slice of cake, sit down, and read the book of Joshua, or the book of Judges, or the book of Samuel. You will find that it will take you about an hour and a half per book. It's short, it's full of good stories, and they're very simple to understand, especially if you compare it to the second part of the prophets. The second part, the later prophets, Nevi'im Achronim, is a very different style of writing. It is not a story being told by a side that knows everything about what happened, but it is a description from the prophets themselves, in first hand, giving quotes of exactly what God tells them and what they tell the people. It is a far higher language, and it is very, very important and meaningful. Because if the first part of the prophets gives us a lot of events, and many messages too, but the latter prophets give us the messages behind the events. Isaiah will be the most quoted prophet in the New Testament too, and in art, in philosophy, in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. We will be talking about the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the prophets who talk about the morality and the theology, about visions to the days to come. Your tourists most likely know more quotes from this part, which is much harder, by the way, than from the Book of Kings. And it's worthwhile to be reading and being able to contextualize to the visitors here these prophets with a specific time and space where they lived. Every prophet starts with an introduction of where and when they lived. For example, if we talk about the three main prophets in this part, Isaiah lived in the times of King Hezekiah and beforehand, in the 8th century BCE. Jeremiah is the prophet of destruction. He lives at the time of the last kings of Judah, at the end of the 7th century BCE and the beginning of the 6th century BCE. Ezekiel already prophesizes in Tel Aviv. Yes, Tel Aviv is actually a name from the book of Ezekiel originally, on the rivers of Babylon, after the exile. So these are the three main prophets, and then we have the 12 minor prophets, which we count in the 24 books that we count as one. And they live in different times. For example, Hosea, Amos, Micha live in the same century as Isaiah. Zechariah, for example, Haggai, Malachi, they all live in the Second Temple period, after Ezekiel. So it's not necessarily chronological here, and it's for us to know, and it's very easy because it says so in the beginning, in the introduction to every prophet, to know the context of where and when they lived, and then you can definitely connect it to many of the biblical sites that you will be touring throughout your journeys in Israel. So that is about the second part, Nevi'im, and the third part, the K, Kaf, represent Ktuvim. Writings. That is the literal meaning of the word Ktuvim. And in the Ktuvim, we have different kinds of writing. We have beautiful poetry. For example, Song of Songs, and the most composed book ever in history, the Book of Psalms. There is no book in the world that had more music written to it, and you hear it all over the world. It is important to all three religions. We have philosophy, the Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastic, Book of Job. These are very philosophical books. We have a category in this section of the Tanakh called the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls. Of course, everything was written on scrolls, so why make this distinction to these 5? Because these 5 scrolls are read in special times of the year. The Song of Songs is dedicated to Passover. Book of Ruth to Shavuot. Lamentations, 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Ecclesiastics to Sukkot, and the Book of Esther, of course, to Purim. We also have in this section of the Tanakh a continuation of the history. We spoke about Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as a timeline, going from the entrance to the land of Israel to the destruction of the first temple at the 25th chapter of the first book of Kings, the second book of Kings, the last chapter. But that is not the end of the Tanakh. The Tanakh does not end with disaster. It doesn't end with catastrophe. It ends with hope. And this continues the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, here in the Ktuvim, which we count as one book. And we also have the book of Chronicles. The book of Chronicles is kind of a summary. from a Judaic perspective, a summary that takes us from Genesis to the return to Zion in the Second Temple period in the Persian times. So that is kind of an overview of the structure of the holy book of Judaism, of the Tanakh. And we'll ask a few basic questions. Who wrote it? When? What do you think? Of course, it depends who you ask. And there'll be different opinions. In the academic world, the main opinion will be belonging to Bible criticism, which is a fascinating realm. And the documentary hypothesis will be a theory that is pretty prominent since the 19th century until today regarding the evolution of a text which was written by different people at different times, according to Bible criticism. And not only, as we will see soon. I will leave the documentary hypothesis and the critic of the question, who wrote the Bible, to another class we have here. In the course we have history and archaeology, and that is the proper place to really talk about how the text evolved throughout the centuries according to the academic opinion. This class here is about religion. What does the religious perspective of Judaism say about this question of who is the author of the text? So what do you think? If you are going to ask, I don't know who you are, of course. You may be watching me with payas and a kippah and tzitzit, and you're a very religious Jew, or maybe you're non-Jew, maybe you're Christian, maybe you're Muslim, maybe you're a Jew with low knowledge of Judaism. So I'm asking you, whoever you are, if you're going to ask your friend who is a religious Jew, who wrote the Tanakh, what would he say? What would she say? Interesting. We are going to do so right now. We are going to a text of authority in Judaism, the Talmud. We'll talk about what it is exactly later on. And we are going to open the tractate of Baba Batra, page 14, where they ask that question, who wrote the scriptures? And then they answer, Moses wrote his own book, meaning 5 books of Moses. Joshua wrote the book which bears his name, Book of Joshua, and the last 8 verses of the Pentateuch. So this opinion in the Talmud says that the last 8 verses in the book of Deuteronomy, where they describe how Moses dies and is buried by God himself and nobody knows where he is buried, Moses did not write himself, but Joshua completed. Okay, Samuel wrote the book which bears his name, which is the book of Samuel, and the book of Judges, and the book of Ruth. David wrote the book of Psalms, not alone, including in the work 10 elders, and of course the text will go on to share who they are and what the names are. Jeremiah wrote the book which bears his name, Book of Jeremiah, and the book of Kings and Lamentations. Where does Jeremiah live? Where? When? Do you remember? We mentioned it before. 6th century BCE already. He lives here in Jerusalem. So we're talking about a long time difference since Moses. So he writes the book that bears his name, the Book of Kings and Lamentations. Hezekiah and his colleagues wrote Isaiah, who was in the same time of King Hezekiah, Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastics. Wait a minute. This is kind of strange because if I read here in the book of Ecclesiastics or in the Song of Songs and Proverbs, I will see that they mention Solomon as the author. So how can the Talmud say something else? Apparently, the Talmud will distinguish between the author, which means the one who created the text, who brought the text to the world orally, and the people who actually sat and wrote it down in scrolls centuries later, after it was passed on in tradition from generation to generation. Let's continue with a text from the Talmud. The men of the Great Assembly, who live in the Second Temple period, wrote Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, Daniel, and the scroll of Esther. Ezra, also 5th century BCE, wrote the book that bears his name and the genealogies of the book of Chronicles. In other words, we have here people from, let's say, 13th century BCE for Moses until the 5th century BCE for Ezra and Nehemiah, writing the different books of the Tanakh. This is different from the documentary hypothesis and Bible criticism, which will push it forward in about 200 years, starting with the 10th century BCE and moving on to the 2nd century BCE, even 300 years pushing things forward. But another difference is here, in the traditional perspective, every book, unless it says otherwise, is pretty much one creation by a specific person in a specific time. While in the documentary hypothesis, the idea is that the books are kind of a late editor, bringing together different texts from different times and different authors in the same book and sometimes in the same chapter. But again, I will let someone else elaborate about that. But the main difference, which is very important, is everyone mentioned here in the Talmud is considered in Jewish tradition, and not only in Jewish tradition, a prophet, which means someone who brought to humanity divine messages. And maybe this is worth kind of a 60 seconds on monotheism, on what most of humanity believes, the Abrahamic religions, who believe that there is a creator to the world, who is good, merciful, gracious. And in his grace, he gave a book of instructions how to use well the gift of life that we got. Then the three religions will only argue about what is the updated, authentic book of instructions. And then within every religion, we'll have arguments on how to interpret and apply to our lives this book. So that is what really distinguishes between the traditional perspective, which will be a perspective of many of you tourists, who believe that this is a divine revelation, and the secular perspective, which will be a perspective of cultural evolution. It is very important for us to understand that we have groups of both kinds, and we need to talk a language that they can relate to. And many times, usually even I would say, we can find both kinds in the same person and in the same group, both perspectives. And we need to be able to understand them well and to speak the language that will bring them together and bring out the meaning of this text, which really affected the entire human race in the last few thousand years. So now, after a short, brief introduction to the Tanakh, we can dive in. We can start actually reading from it and going into the grand narrative of the Jewish people. But first, I believe you and I deserve a little break. So I'll see you soon.